Imagine this. Someone you love, a partner, a friend, a parent, maybe even yourself, gets hurt. Not physically, deeper than that. Something is said that cuts, something is done that wounds. And instead of screaming, instead of crying, instead of demanding answers the way every instinct in the human body is wired to do, they go quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, not the quiet of someone who has found serenity. This is the quiet of a door being locked from the inside. The quiet of someone retreating so far behind their own eyes that you begin to wonder if they're even still in there. You reach out, and they respond, but barely. You ask if something's wrong, and they say, "I'm fine." 2 words, a closed gate, an entire universe of pain compressed into the most dishonest sentence in the English language. And here's what makes it so disorienting. You know something is wrong. They know something is wrong. You both know that you both know. And yet, the silence continues, like an unspoken agreement to pretend. Like 2 people standing on either side of a burning building, both watching it collapse, neither one willing to call it a fire. If this is already hitting close to home, if you recognize yourself or someone you love in these words, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. What we're about to unpack goes deep. You won't want to miss a single part of it. Now, ask yourself this. Why would a person in pain choose silence over expression? We live in a world that tells us to speak up, to use our words, to communicate openly, a world drowning in therapy speak and emotional literacy content, where vulnerability is celebrated as courage and silence is treated as avoidance. So why, even armed with the language, even knowing better, do so many people still go silent when they're hurt the most? Here's the paradox that nobody talks about. Silence in these moments is not weakness. It is not simply avoidance, immaturity, or an inability to communicate. In many cases, going silent is the most sophisticated emotional response a person is capable of. It is strategic, it is protective. It is, in its own devastating way, a form of love. Because the person going silent often believes, consciously or not, that their pain is too large, too dangerous, or too shameful to be spoken aloud without destroying everything around them. But here is where it gets darker. What if the very act of going silent, that careful, controlled, self-protective retreat, is also one of the most destructive things a person can do? Not just to the relationship, not just to the person who is left confused and helpless on the outside, but to the silent one themselves. What if the silence that feels like armor is actually a slow poison? What if the very mechanism designed to keep you safe is the thing quietly dismantling you from the inside? Think about the last time you went silent, not the polite silence of choosing your words carefully, the other kind, the kind where something inside you closed, where you decided, maybe without even deciding, that it wasn't worth it, that they wouldn't understand, that saying it out loud would only make it worse, or make you look weak, or open a wound that might never close again. What did that silence cost you? And think about the last time someone went silent on you. Do you remember how it felt to be on the outside of that locked door? The helplessness, the guilt, even when you weren't sure what you'd done. The desperate urge to fix something you couldn't even name. Silence, it turns out, is not the absence of communication. It is one of the loudest, most complex, most emotionally loaded signals one human being can send to another. So the question isn't simply, why do people go silent when they're hurt? The real question, the one that psychology, philosophy, and the deepest corners of human experience force us to sit with, is this. What is happening inside a person who has learned that their pain has no safe place to land? The answer is more ancient, more structural, and more urgently relevant than you might expect. Because this silence didn't start with the argument you had last Tuesday. It didn't begin in your current relationship or even your childhood bedroom, though it almost certainly passed through there. It started somewhere much older, much deeper. And it has been shaping you, and the people you love, ever since. To understand why people go silent when they're hurt, you have to go back, not just to childhood, not just to a single defining moment, but to the very architecture of the human psyche. Because this silence has roots, ancient ones, and they run so deep that most people will live their entire lives feeling the symptoms without ever once understanding the cause. Carl Jung, one of the most penetrating minds in the history of psychology, introduced the concept of the shadow, the part of the self that we hide, suppress, and refuse to acknowledge. Not because it is inherently evil, but because at some point in our development, we learned that certain parts of us were unwelcome, too loud, too needy, too emotional, too much. And so, with the quiet efficiency of a survival mechanism, we buried those parts. We tucked them beneath layers of composure, competence, and the performance of being fine. The person who goes silent when they're hurt is, in almost every case, someone whose emotional expression was, at some critical point, met with dismissal, punishment, or indifference. A child who cried and was told to stop being dramatic. A teenager who opened up and was laughed at, or worse, weaponized against. A partner who expressed pain and watched it be minimized, twisted, or used as ammunition in the next argument. Over time, the psyche draws a logical, if devastating, conclusion. Expressing pain is dangerous, and so it stops. Not out of weakness, out of intelligence, out of a deep, adaptive wisdom that learned the hard way that vulnerability has a price. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that the most courageous act is still to think for yourself, aloud. But what he understood, perhaps better than anyone, was that most people never reach that courage. Not because they lack it, but because the world consistently punishes its expression. Nietzsche himself was a man who felt profoundly misunderstood, who poured his most urgent truths into work that was largely ignored in his lifetime. His silence wasn't passive. It was the silence of a man who had spoken and found no one truly listening. Sound familiar? Arthur Schopenhauer went even further. He argued that human suffering is not an anomaly. It is the default state of existence. And one of the cruelest dimensions of that suffering, he believed, is its fundamental incommunicability. We cannot fully transfer our inner experience to another person. Language is always approximate. Pain, in particular, resists translation. So when someone goes silent in their hurt, they may not simply be choosing not to speak. They may have arrived instinctively at the same conclusion Schopenhauer spent a lifetime articulating, that no words exist that could make you truly understand what I am carrying. This is where psychology and philosophy converge on something deeply unsettling. Jean-Paul Sartre famously declared that hell is other people, not as a misanthropic dismissal, but as a recognition that the presence of others forces us into a kind of self-consciousness, a vulnerability, an exposure that can feel unbearable. To speak your pain is to hand someone a map of your interior world. And if you have ever had that map used against you, if someone has ever taken your openness and responded with cruelty, carelessness, or cold indifference, then you know exactly why that door gets locked. But here is the psychological dimension that cuts deepest. This pattern doesn't stay in one relationship, it travels. The child who learned to go silent carries that silence into every friendship, every romance, every professional relationship they will ever have. What began as a specific adaptive response to a specific threatening environment becomes, over time, a personality trait, a default setting, a way of moving through the world that feels so natural, so intrinsic, that the person no longer even recognizes it as a learned behavior. They simply believe, this is who I am. I am someone who deals with things alone. I am someone who doesn't burden others. I am someone who is strong enough to not need. And that belief, that quietly devastating, deeply convincing belief, is where the real damage begins. Because strength and silence are not the same thing. Endurance and healing are not the same thing. And the person who has spent years perfecting the art of disappearing into themselves when the pain becomes unbearable has not escaped their suffering. They have simply driven it underground, where it will continue to do its work, unseen, unaddressed, and with terrifying patience. The silence, it turns out, was never really silence at all. It was a pressure building behind a sealed door. And doors, no matter how carefully reinforced, eventually give way.
Here is something nobody warns you about when you learn to go silent with your pain. The silence doesn't stay contained. You imagine it like a room you can lock. Somewhere you put the hurt, close the door, and return to your life. Manageable, controlled, yours alone. But the mind is not a house with separate rooms. It is a single, continuous ecosystem. And what you bury in one corner quietly poisons the soil everywhere else. Neuroscience has begun to confirm what philosophers intuited centuries ago. When emotional pain is suppressed rather than processed, the brain doesn't file it away neatly. The amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped structure at the brain's emotional core, continues to register the unprocessed threat as active, as present, as ongoing. The body remains in a low-grade state of alert, flooding itself with cortisol and stress hormones that were designed for short-term survival emergencies, not the long, slow burn of unspoken grief. Over time, this creates what researchers call allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of chronic emotional suppression. In plain terms, your body keeps the score, even when your mind refuses to acknowledge the game being played. But the consequences don't stop at the biological. They reshape perception itself. Psychologists have identified a cognitive pattern called negative attribution bias, the tendency, once established, to interpret ambiguous situations through the lens of past wounds. The person who has learned to go silent with their pain doesn't just suppress their feelings in the present, they begin to see the world through the distorted lens of every hurt they never expressed. A partner who is simply tired becomes someone who doesn't care. A friend who forgets to reply becomes proof of abandonment. A moment of ordinary disconnection becomes evidence of a deeper, more terrifying truth, that I am fundamentally alone and always will be. This is the hidden cruelty of unprocessed pain. It doesn't just live in the past, it colonizes the future. And then there is what psychologists call emotional blunting, one of the most insidious consequences of long-term suppression. The person who repeatedly forces their pain underground eventually finds that they have lost access not just to the difficult emotions, but to all of them. Joy becomes muted. Excitement feels distant. Love, even when it is right there, real and available, feels somehow unreachable, like trying to grasp something through thick glass. The very mechanism that was built to protect you from pain ends up insulating you from everything else as well. You don't just stop feeling the bad things. You stop fully feeling at all. Aldous Huxley, in his profound and deeply unsettling way, once suggested that the greatest dangers to human experience are not the dramatic catastrophes we see coming, but the quiet, incremental erosions we never notice until it is too late. The silent person is rarely aware of how much they have lost. They adapted so gradually, so skillfully, that the diminishment felt like growth. The numbness felt like strength. The distance felt like wisdom. And here is where the societal dimension becomes impossible to ignore, because this pattern of silence is not randomly distributed. It is culturally engineered, and engineered with particular ferocity in certain groups. Men, for generations, have been conditioned by a brutal and unforgiving cultural script that equates emotional expression with weakness, emotional vulnerability with failure, and silence with dignity. The result is a demographic that has been systematically taught to lock the door on their inner lives from the earliest possible age, and then left to wonder, decades later, why they feel so profoundly alone, even in rooms full of people who love them. But women are not exempt from this engineering. They face a different but equally damaging script, one that teaches them that their pain is an inconvenience, that their emotional needs are excessive, that to express hurt is to be difficult, dramatic, or too much. So they go silent in a different way. Not the cold, steeled silence of someone who has decided not to feel, but the exhausted silence of someone who has been told in 1,000 small ways that their feelings are a burden no one should have to carry. Viktor Frankl, who survived the unsurvivable and emerged with perhaps the clearest eyes of any psychologist who ever lived, understood that the deepest human suffering comes not from pain itself, but from pain that has no witness, no acknowledgement, no meaning. He wrote that a person can endure almost any what if they have a why, but a person whose pain goes unseen, unnamed, and unacknowledged begins to lose not just their peace, but their sense of self. And that is the final, most devastating consequence of the silence. It doesn't just isolate you from others, it isolates you from yourself. The person who has spent years swallowing their pain eventually loses the ability to locate it accurately. They know something is wrong. They can feel the weight of it, the heaviness that never quite lifts, but they can no longer identify what it is, where it came from, or what it needs. They become strangers to their own interior landscape, wandering through their own life with no map, no language, and no clear sense of where the wound actually is. This is not a small problem. This is a person slowly disappearing. And the most haunting part? From the outside, they often look completely fine. They function. They show up. They smile at the right moments, say the right things, perform the role assigned to them with quiet, practiced competence. Nobody sees the erosion happening underneath. Nobody knows about the locked room, the sealed door, the pressure that has been building for years behind a face that learned, long ago, to give nothing away. But something always knows, and eventually, in ways that cannot be predicted, cannot be controlled, and cannot be stopped, it will find a way to be heard. The only question is whether you choose how that happens, or whether you wait until it chooses for you.
So here you are. You have seen the architecture of the silence. You understand where it came from, how it was built, and what it has been costing you, layer by layer, year by year, in ways so gradual you mistook the erosion for evolution. And now comes the moment that most self-help content gets catastrophically wrong. Because what you are about to hear is not a list of communication tips. It is not a breathing exercise or a journaling prompt. What we are talking about is something far more radical, far more unsettling, and far more powerful than any of that. We are talking about a complete dismantling of the story you have been telling yourself about what it means to be strong. Here is the counterintuitive truth that changes everything. The silence was never really about protecting yourself from others. It was about protecting yourself, from the full, unfiltered experience of your own pain. Because somewhere along the way, you learned not just that expressing pain was dangerous, you learned that feeling it was dangerous. That if you truly allowed yourself to sit with the depth of what you carry, something irreversible might happen. You might fall apart. You might discover something about yourself, or your relationships, or your life, that you cannot unknow. And so the silence became not just a wall between you and others, but a wall between you and your own interior truth. The rebellion, then, does not begin with a conversation. It begins with a confrontation with yourself. The Stoic philosophers understood something about this that modern psychology is only now beginning to quantify. Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire while quietly carrying grief, loneliness, and existential doubt that would have broken most people, wrote repeatedly in his private journals about the discipline of turning inward, not to escape the world, but to face it more honestly. He did not suppress his inner life. He examined it relentlessly, with the cool, unflinching eye of someone who understood that the unexamined pain does not disappear, it governs. And a man who is governed by unexamined pain is not free, no matter how composed he appears on the surface. This is the first radical shift. Stop treating your silence as a neutral act. It is not neutral. Every time you swallow something that needed to be said, you are making a choice, and that choice has a direction. It moves you further from yourself, further from authentic connection, and further from the life that is actually available to you on the other side of honest expression. Begin to see the silence not as a safe default, but as an active decision with active consequences. Because only when you recognize it as a choice can you begin to choose differently. The second shift is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. You must become willing to be misunderstood. One of the deepest reasons people go silent is the anticipation of an inadequate response. They have played out the conversation in their head. They have imagined saying the true thing, the vulnerable thing, the thing that costs them something. And they have imagined the other person responding with confusion, defensiveness, or dismissal. And so they decide preemptively that it isn't worth it. But here is what that logic misses entirely. The goal of expressing your pain is not to guarantee a perfect response. The goal is to stop carrying it alone. The release, the act of giving your pain a voice, even an imperfect one, even to an imperfect listener, is itself transformative. Not because it always fixes the relationship, but because it repairs the relationship you have with yourself. Brené Brown's decades of research on vulnerability converge on a finding that is as simple as it is revolutionary. The people who experience the deepest sense of connection, love, and belonging are not the ones who have the most perfect relationships. They are the ones who have decided that they are worthy of being seen, even in their pain, even in their mess, even in the moments when they have no idea how to articulate what they are carrying. Worthiness, it turns out, is not something you earn through composure. It is something you claim through courage. History is full of those who broke the silence and changed everything because of it. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, could have emerged hollowed out and hardened, sealed behind the kind of silence that suffering of that magnitude would justify in anyone. Instead, he chose radical honesty about both his pain and his hope. That honesty did not make him weak. It made him the most morally powerful figure in a room full of people who had never been tested the way he had. His voice, the one that could have gone permanently silent, became the instrument of a nation's healing. The third and perhaps most liberating shift is this: redefine what expression actually means. Breaking the silence does not always require a confrontation. It does not always mean sitting across from the person who hurt you and delivering a perfectly articulated account of your interior experience. Sometimes it means writing the letter you never send. Sometimes it means speaking the truth to a therapist, a journal, a trusted friend who has earned the right to hear it. Sometimes it means simply sitting alone in a quiet room and allowing yourself, for the first time in years, to feel the full weight of what you have been carrying, without immediately reaching for the mechanism that makes it stop. Because here is what the silence has stolen from you, perhaps most of all: the experience of your own resilience. You have never fully felt your pain, which means you have never fully discovered that you can survive it. And that discovery, the lived, embodied knowledge that you can feel the worst of it and still be standing on the other side, is the only thing that genuinely dissolves the fear that has kept the door locked all this time. The silence was a fortress, but you were never meant to live in a fortress. You were meant to live in the world, messy, exposed, imperfect, and fully, undeniably alive. And the key to that life has been inside you the entire time.
There is a moment, and perhaps you have felt it, even if you have never had the words for it, where the silence becomes so complete, so total, so woven into the fabric of who you are, that you stop experiencing it as something you do and begin experiencing it as something you are. It is no longer a coping mechanism. It is no longer a wall you built. It has become, in the most quietly devastating way possible, your identity. You are the person who handles things alone. You are the person who doesn't need. You are the person who is always fine, always steady, always the one others lean on, because you dismantled your own needs so thoroughly, so long ago, that you genuinely cannot locate them anymore. And here is the deepest, most shattering truth of everything we have explored today. That person, the one who is always fine, is not strong. They are disappeared. Not gone, not broken beyond repair, but disappeared, in the way that a person disappears when they have spent so long performing a version of themselves that the original, unedited, unarmored self has been buried so deep beneath the performance that even they have lost access to it. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is something far quieter and far more common. It is the person who sits in a room full of people who love them and feels completely, inexplicably alone. It is the person who achieves everything they were supposed to achieve and feels nothing upon arrival. It is the person who is described by everyone around them as so strong, so together, so reliable, and who cries, if they cry at all, only when they are certain no one can hear. Carl Jung spent his life circling one central conviction: that the unlived life, the parts of ourselves we suppress, deny, and silence, does not simply disappear. It accumulates. It presses against the walls of the psyche with increasing force until it finds expression. And if we do not give it a conscious, chosen outlet, it will find an unconscious one. It will emerge as depression, as chronic anxiety that seems disproportionate to its trigger, as physical illness, as the slow, grinding erosion of relationships that could not survive the distance created by a person who was never fully present because they were always, on some level, in hiding. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey toward becoming wholly, authentically yourself. Not the self that was shaped by every wound and every lesson about what was safe to show the world. The self that exists beneath all of that. The one that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for you to finally stop being afraid of it. And this is where the paradigm shifts completely. Because everything you have been told about your silence, that it is a flaw to fix, a wound to heal, a bad habit to break, misses the most important thing. Your silence was not a mistake. It was not a sign of weakness or damage or dysfunction. It was the most intelligent response available to you at the time it was formed. It was a child or a younger version of you doing the most sophisticated thing they knew how to do with an amount of pain that exceeded their capacity to process. That deserves not shame, but recognition. Not judgment, but compassion. The revolutionary act is not to condemn the silence, it is to thank it, genuinely, fully, for what it protected you from when you had no other tools. And then, with the clarity and courage that only comes from truly understanding why the wall was built, to begin, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, to take it down. This is what genuine healing actually looks like. Not the sudden cinematic breakthrough, not the single conversation that fixes everything, but the slow, unglamorous, profoundly courageous practice of choosing, again and again, in small moments and large ones, to give your inner life a voice. To say, I am not fine when you are not fine. To say, that hurt me when something hurts you. To say, I need when you need. Not because you are guaranteed a perfect response, but because the alternative is a life lived entirely behind glass, visible to everyone, touched by no one. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. The silence for so long has been a way of collapsing that space entirely, of going from wound to withdrawal without passing through the terrifying, necessary territory of conscious choice. The practice of breaking the silence is at its core the practice of reclaiming that space, of inserting yourself, your true, feeling, undefended self, back into the gap between what happens to you and how you respond. And here is what becomes possible on the other side of that practice. Not perfection, not the elimination of pain. Pain is the price of being alive and caring about things, and anyone who promises you otherwise is selling something. What becomes possible is presence, full, unguarded, genuine presence in your own life. The ability to feel joy without immediately bracing for its loss. The ability to love without the constant, exhausting background vigilance of someone who has learned that love is conditional and safety is temporary. The ability to sit with another human being in their pain and in your own without needing to fix it, escape it, or pretend it isn't there. That is not a small thing. In a world that is running at extraordinary speed from every uncomfortable feeling, in a culture that has monetized distraction and made numbness into a lifestyle, the ability to be present with pain, yours and others, is perhaps the most radical and most necessary human skill there is. So let this be the question you carry out of this room today, not as a source of guilt or urgency, but as a genuine, open, life-orienting inquiry. What has your silence been protecting you from feeling? Not what it has been protecting you from saying, what it has been protecting you from feeling, because the words were never really the point. The point was always the feeling underneath them, the one that has been waiting in that locked room in the dark for someone trustworthy enough to finally open the door. And here is the most important thing, the thing I want you to hold long after this video ends.
You are that person. Not the therapist, not the perfect partner, not the friend who finally says the right thing. You are the one with the key. You have always been the one with the key. The door was never locked from the outside. It was locked from the inside, which means the power to open it was yours from the very beginning. The silence made sense once. It kept you safe when safety was scarce and vulnerability was a liability you could not afford. But you are not in that place anymore. And even if some part of you still feels like you are, even if the old fear rises every time you consider speaking the true thing, know this. The version of you that learned to go silent was surviving. The version of you that learns to speak again, honestly, imperfectly, courageously, is finally, after all this time, beginning to live. And that life, your life, fully felt, fully expressed, fully inhabited, has been waiting for you. It is still waiting. All you have to do is break the silence.